friends, colleagues, guests, those of you who are joining us online, you're all very, very welcome indeed to the Neil Hoey Theatre here in the Trinity Long Room Hub for another of our Behind the Headlines. Tonight we are dealing with race, and we're going to ask the question, does race matter? My name's Jane Nolmeier, and I'm the director of the Trinity Long Room Hub. And for those of you who don't know us, we're a research institute in the arts and humanities, and we really do three things. So the first thing we do is celebrate the excellence in the arts and humanities, which goes back to the 17th century and continues to this day. The second thing we do is promote conversations in and across disciplines. And really the hub is all about inter and multidisciplinarity, and we believe that the magic happens when the disciplines collide, as I think they're going to tonight. And then the third thing we do is public humanities. So we have a whole series of signature events, including this Behind the Headlines public discussion series, which is supported by the John Pollard Foundation. In these Behind the Headlines, we look at topics that are being debated in the media, or that are highly relevant to the times in which we're living. And what we want to do is to apply the rich and long-term perspectives of the arts and humanities, and to provide a very respectful public discourse, but also to embrace nuance and combat simplification. Now, our conversation this evening could not be more timely. And I suspect we're going to be addressing issues that never actually go away. So we're really, really delighted to have a very, very distinguished panel for you this evening. We'll be looking at race and technology, the history of the civil rights movement here and in the North, apartheid, the experiences of navigating higher education with visible difference of race. And I think we're really going to get some fascinating insights on our question of does race matter. So I'm going to introduce the speakers in the order in which they'll speak. And our first speaker tonight is Professor Daniel Geary, who is the Mark Pigott Professor in American History here at Trinity. And Dan's research focuses on the intellectual, political and cultural history of the 20th century United States. And he obviously has a real interest in race and ethnicity, as well as the transnational history of the civil rights movements and of white nationalism and the relationship of politics to popular culture. He had a cracking op-ed in the Irish Independent this morning. I don't know if any of you read it. If not, I would encourage you to do so. But one of his current projects includes a book on the rise and fall of the concept of racial integration, and a study of connections between the US and Northern Ireland during the civil rights era, and that's what the op-ed looked at. So, great to hear, Dan. Our second speaker tonight is Eugenia Ciapera. Have I got that right, Eugenia? Yeah, forgive me. She's professor and head of the School of Information and Communication Studies at UCD. Her research focuses on digital media and hate speech, covering both racism and misogyny. She completed very recently, in 2018, a project on tracking and monitoring racist hate speech in social media, which was funded by the Irish Research Council. It's nice to give the Irish Research Council a plug. I've got a vested interest in doing so, of course. And the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, they co-funded it with the IRC. So it's really lovely that you're here with us this evening, Eugenia, and we look forward to hearing from you as well. Also joining us this evening is Sahar Ahmed, who is a PhD student in our School of Law. She's researching the right to freedom of religion within the international human rights legal system and Islamic jurisprudence. Sahar has a fascinating life story. I was chatting to her earlier but she practiced as a commercial and corporate barrister in Lahore, appearing before the courts as an advocate of the High Courts of Pakistan, and covered a whole range of contentious issues, and no doubt we'll be hearing about some of them, or maybe not. And then she has also studied at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, in the University of London, where she did a LLM. I was going to say a prize-winning LLM. She was awarded the School of Law's prize for best performing LLM student. Last but not least, and I say this because my dear friend Pramesh Lalu, who is currently a visiting research fellow here at the Trinity Longroom Hub. Pramesh is also the director of the Centre for Humanities Research, which is a national research foundation flagship at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. Do any of you remember Kader Asmal? There's a number of us in the audience who remember Kader Asmal very well. So Pramesh also was a great friend of Kader Asmal. He's the co-editor of Remains of the Social, Desiring the Post-Apartheid, and also of Becoming UWC, Reflections, Pathways, and Unmaking Apartheid's Legacies. Both Pramesh and I are on the board of an organisation called the Consortium of Humanities Centres and Institutes. And I cannot tell you, Pramesh, how much we've enjoyed having you here in Trinity. He's been with us for the last 3 months. Sadly, he's leaving next week because he's just brought such wisdom and so many wonderful insights to the community here in the Hub. So we're absolutely thrilled that you're able to join us on the panel this evening. So those are our 4 speakers. Those of you who are familiar with the series know that they're all limited to 9 minutes, so everybody has a very strict 9-minute rule because we want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. We are live streaming tonight's conversation and we'll also be podcasting it. We would encourage those of you who like to tweet to please do so using the hashtag is it Hub Matters, or actually, what is it? Oh, there it is there, sorry, at the TLRH. So please now welcome Professor Daniel Geary.
Thank you very much, Jane. Well, who better to kick off a discussion about race than a white guy? Race is not a natural phenomenon, even though I think we're inclined, all of us, even those who know better at some level, to think of it that way. Race is a historical, a political, and a cultural phenomenon. It is not a noun. I mean, it is a noun, but really race should be thought of more as a verb. It's something that happens, not something that is. And moreover, it's complicated because race is not simply racism and racialization, that is, a superior group defining an inferior group as a separate race in order to oppress them, but it can also be used in resistance, groups that have been oppressed taking on certain racial identities. So I think I want us to think of race as something that's complicated and that's historically rooted in different ideologies and power relations. And I'm going to illustrate this by, well, I'm a historian, so I'm going to tell a story. And this is a story of civil rights activist Bernadette Devlin's 1969 trip to the United States, in which she baffled Irish Americans by repeatedly identifying with African Americans on the trip. So, 50 years ago, Devlin captured American media attention on a tour sponsored by Irish American groups with the design of highlighting Catholic oppression in Northern Ireland and raising funds for them. At the start of the Troubles, American attention was beginning to shift toward Ulster, and the fashionably dressed, charismatic, 22-year-old Westminster MP, Devlin, was a major attraction. She spoke to mass audiences in American cities, she gave interviews to national media outlets, and she even appeared on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Devlin's trip and her popularity was so threatening, indeed, to Unionists, that Stormont dispatched a so-called True Squad of MPs to the U.S. in order to refute her claims, and the Reverend Ian Paisley embarked on an impromptu American speaking tour organized by his longtime American ally, the right-wing minister Carl McIntyre. Paisley had his own connections on the other side of things to American segregationists that I'd be happy to talk about later, but I'll leave that to the side for now. Throughout her visit, Devlin repeatedly made common cause with African Americans. After all, the Northern Irish Civil Rights Movement had taken considerable inspiration from the African American movement, borrowing tactics, iconography, and even the very civil rights name itself. But Devlin's identification with African Americans surprised Irish Americans. At a rally in Philadelphia, Devlin discomforted her audience when she asked the African American singer who was there to provide that night's entertainment, mainly by singing Irish Republican songs. Devlin asked when she had the choice to recommend a song. She asked that he sing "We Shall Overcome," the civil rights anthem in the U.S. and in Northern Ireland as well. Some of the audience began to walk out at that point, so Devlin joined him on the stage in an effort to shame Irish Americans who refused to make the links between the two struggles. In Detroit, Devlin refused to speak until hundreds of African Americans who wished to hear her were allowed into the venue. And in Chicago, she pointedly declined to meet with the Irish American mayor, Richard Daley, partly because she viewed him as a racist. And most controversially, Devlin was given a key to the city by the mayor of New York, and this was later handed over to the Black Panthers by her comrade Eamon McCann in a future trip. For good measure, McCann denounced Irish Americans as hypocrites for supporting equality in Northern Ireland, but not in the U.S. Devlin, too, was frustrated by Irish Americans who actively supported civil rights for Catholics in Northern Ireland, but not racial equality in the U.S. "I cannot understand," she said, "the mental conflict of some of our Irish Americans who will fight forever for the struggle of justice in Ireland, and yet play the role of the oppressor and will not stand shoulder to shoulder with their fellow Black Americans." She was especially disturbed by some of her hosts on the visit, wealthy Irish Americans who repeated racist anti-Black tropes to her. To Devlin, they, quote, "looked and sounded like orange men. They said exactly the same things about blacks that the Loyalists said about us back home." Irish Americans were baffled by Devlin's equation of the two civil rights struggles. After all, the Irish, like other European immigrant groups in the U.S., had obtained social privilege by defining themselves as white. By defining themselves against blacks, they erased earlier notions that the Irish were a different and inferior race to the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who had traditionally run the country. Therefore, many conservative Irish Americans were outraged by Devlin's claims. Like other white Americans, they denied the persistent reality of racial inequality, viewing African American inequality as self-inflicted. But it's not that all Irish Americans were racist. They certainly weren't. But even the liberal Irish Americans who supported African American civil rights were puzzled by Devlin's behavior, seeing no obvious links between the causes of Irish and African American freedom. In the U.S., to be Irish was to be white, which meant to be not black. But for Catholics in Northern Ireland, it was possible not just to make common cause with the African American freedom struggle, but to actually assert an identity as in some sense black. A frequent refrain in the civil rights struggle was that Catholics were Ulster's Negroes. There were many reasons for this identification, highlighting similar situations such as housing discrimination, job discrimination, and political gerrymandering. Moreover, the African American civil rights struggle had received very positive coverage in the British and Northern Irish media. So if Ulster Protestants and the British public could be convinced that the situation of Catholics in Northern Ireland was analogous to that of African Americans, it meant their cause was a truly just one. But I don't think this was simply a propaganda move on the part of civil rights activists in the North. As I think Devlin's story shows, there was a genuine and instinctive identification with African Americans. That's not to say that this identification was without its own problems. Overdrawing the analogy between Northern Irish Catholics and African Americans conflated the very different oppressions of the two groups in ways that could actually deny the scale of African slavery and its aftermath. For example, today there's a persistent myth that sees the indentured servitude of the Irish in the colonial United States as equivalent to the enslavement of Africans. This myth in the US serves the purpose of saying that, well, since the Irish were once oppressed and have now made good in America, blacks have nothing to complain about. That myth, incidentally, has been repeated by none other than Gerry Adams, for whom it no doubt had a very different valence, more similar to the identification promoted by those such as Devlin earlier. At times, identification with African Americans could even shade over into a form of racism. For example, at a civil rights protest in Dungannon in 1963, two young boys held a sign reading, "They talk about Alabama, why don't they talk about Dungannon?" They were dressed in blackface. And the implication of their sign was not necessarily one of identification with the African American movement, so much as suggesting that blacks in America shouldn't get the same attention for their struggle as whites in Ireland. It would be wrong for blacks to get rights before whites did. To her credit, Devlin came to recognize some of these complexities. She later recognized, for example, that when at that 1969 Philadelphia rally, she'd asked the African-American singer to sing "We Shall Overcome," she put him in a very difficult position without his consent. And her visit to the US led to concrete connections with African-American activists, especially those in the Black Panthers, that led her to a more considered understanding of the relationship between blacks in America and whites in Ulster. But nevertheless, I think her visit shows the complex ways in which racial identification works, and I suppose this especially complicated relationship that exists historically and today between the Irish diaspora, and people of African descent. Thank you.
Thank you. So moving a few decades later, I just want to focus today on the digital world and make the argument that instead of leveling the playing field, the new technologies in fact both reproduce existing inequalities and produce new ones. And this begins with a reference, let's say, to the kind of ideology that underpins a lot of the technology and a lot of the digital world, which is referred to as the Californian Ideology. Is a combination of California-based countercultural ideas about individualism and meritocracy, along with techno-solutionism, the technologies that innovation will resolve existing social and political problems. However, reality has proven to be very, very different. And I will try to explain this with reference to specifically hate speech and racially toxic contents that circulate in the digital world, and especially in social media. So to begin with, and I'm sure this doesn't come as a surprise to you, all kinds of informational contents on the web are arranged and organized through algorithms, little recipes that people use to organize, to kind of organize contents. So in terms of these algorithms, the way in which they work is that they learn through being fed with data. And the data they feed into them determines the output. So a lot of you might have heard about the recent shift towards data-driven decisions as a better way of, let's say, organizing society because they're fairer, they're scientific, they're technological, they're innovative. However, if you feed to these algorithms data that are already biased, the outcome that you get is itself biased. So now we have a situation where there is a shift across different domains in terms of using data, but the data sets that we have are very, very biased. And I'll give you two examples of this. One was a recent article published, an investigation published in ProPublica in the US, where they found that when it comes to risk assessments through algorithms, which take a lot of factors in order to come up with a better kind of risk assessment, what happened was that that in fact these algorithms systematically discriminate against minorities by, for example, denying them bail or contributing to higher sentences. So this has happened in the United States.
In other areas, researchers created a machine learning tool to recognize skin cancer from photographs. The problem, however, was that the data set they fed into it relied on Google Images, and Google Images has only 5% of its photographs are based on darker skinned people. So this kind of like tool that supposedly recognizes skin cancer effectively discriminates against darker skinned people. So we see here that algorithms in this respect reproduce the same kind of like racial logics that structure the physical and material world. But moving on to content, which is something that I'm much more familiar with, in our research in the context of Ireland, using a tool that we developed, we found that in fact racially toxic contents in Ireland are almost ubiquitous, and they're triggered by everything and nothing, if you want. Certain topics certainly triggered much more toxicity. For example, anything that referred to housing or welfare, anything that referred to refugees, anything that referred to travelers triggered massive amounts of toxic speech. But the problem is not that this speech circulates, it's that it does things. And one of the things that we have recently realized is that in fact toxic speech online is linked to real life violence. And we saw this very clearly more recently with the Christchurch terrorist attacks, but also before that with the Pittsburgh synagogue attacks and also the Finsbury Park mosque attack in London. So there is also some research that has shown that there is a causal link between online hate speech and street violence. It's a very important paper that has been written in the context of Germany, where they found that almost there is a kind of like a correspondence between anti-refugee posts and anti-refugee incidents. So these researchers did a study where they studied the Facebook page of AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, the alt-right, or extreme right for some, political party in Germany, and they found for every 4 anti-refugee posts left on the page, there was one real-life attack against refugees. And they tested this model when they found that when there was an internet outage, the incidence of violence against refugees decreased. So it was a very kind of like robust finding. But hate speech against racialized people, it's not only words and it's not only linked to violence, but it's also linked to what we can call economic vandalism. So in a context where more and more of us have to rely on a digital presence in order to survive basically economically, we see that racialized people are hounded out of the internet because of toxic hate speech used against them. And here we have the example of the study of Becky Gardner, who used to be the editor of The Guardian's Comment is Free, who found that of all the people who were posting opinion articles on the site, people of ethnic minority backgrounds, and especially women of ethnic minority backgrounds, were at the forefront of receiving all this hate. And some of them would say things like, you know, I'm not sure I'm in the right profession, I should move outside of this. So why do we have this kind of like abundance, let's say, of hateful contents? Well, it's very difficult to kind of like explain this now, but certainly one factor, contributory factor, is the inability or unwillingness of social media platforms to effectively deal with this issue. And one reason for this is their ideology, which is an individualist, liberal ideology that does not take into account any kind of like historicity or context, and considers all categories the same. So then if you have like a piece of content which is, and excuse me for this, but it's an actual example of Facebook. So if a post such as "white men are assholes" is left on Facebook, this is going to be taken down as hateful hate speech. However, if you put a content such as "poor black children should still sit in the back of the bus," or "immigrants are filthy," or "immigrants are filth," these are going to be to remain online. So this is the kind of distinctions that Facebook is making between what they call protected categories and quasi-protected categories, or even unprotected categories. So poor children, poor black children, is what they call a quasi-protected category, so it doesn't have the same degree of protection as other ones. So also, of course, Facebook is really invested in terms of circulating contents online because that's how they make money. So the other problem now coming to regulating hate speech online is, how do we report this? Who reports this? And if I ask you here, I will for sure find out that the main people who report this are the people who are at the receiving end. So racialized people are tasked with the task of actually reporting these contents to be removed. So it's an extra kind of like, let's say, labor that they have to perform because no one else is doing it. I mean, now Facebook is running algorithms, but again, the burden of this falls onto the shoulders again of people who are racialized. So to conclude, I want to say this: rather than leveling the playing field or enabling the full participation of racialized others, digital technologies and media in fact generate more inequalities because they exclude racialized others from participating fully in the development, programming, design of new technologies, because they increasingly make use of data-driven decisions but relying on racially biased data, because they regulate the flows of hate instead of actually removing the hate speech from online environments, and because they rely on the free labor of racialized people in reporting these contents, but without actually allowing them to have a say as to what they want to remain online or not. So I will stop here.
Thank you.
Unlike everybody else who is a very accomplished professor, I am not a researcher of anything remotely related to race. Well, that can be argued, I suppose, but I am not a researcher of critical race theory. I do not study race. So what am I doing here? I am actually doing the absolute first thing that needs to be done when having any conversation about race in a white setting. I am taking up this space that has been ceded by a white institution in a position of power and privilege, in this case, the Long Room Hub, to offer a first-hand narrative of experiencing institutionalized racism. As black and brown bodies, we are often the last ones to actually be asked to speak about our experiences. White scholars do research about black and brown communities, and they are hired by white institutions to speak about the experiences of black and brown communities to other white scholars and white audiences in other white institutions. It is cyclical and never-ending. So I actually thank the Hub for having the moral fortitude in this case to cede power in a way. It is the very first step that needs to be taken to have a conversation. When I moved to Ireland, I did not research what life was going to be like for a woman of colour, and particularly as one in academia. And nearly 3 years on, I am constantly reminded on a very daily basis that I am indeed a person of colour. And that informs every single interaction I have both on campus and off it as well. And so my experience of racism in higher education in Ireland has been both personal but also observational. The personal being informed by my experiences of navigating the system and academia as a scholar with the very visible baggage of race. And the observational through my experiences of forming friendships and associations with other students of colour. So I'm going to look at those personal and observational narratives to make some high-level suggestions of what the university needs to do in order to address this. As a PhD student, we are often told that you are not alone and everyone goes through this by other postgraduate students because the PhD, as those of us doing it know, is not an easy thing to undertake. But what no one tells you is how being the only woman of colour is going to be emotionally and psychologically crippling. Certainly no one told me how I was going to constantly be told that I am doing me search. In other words, you're obviously working on Islam and minority rights because you are a Muslim woman. We, the black and brown bodies, are not considered epistemological authorities on our own lives. It is again cyclical. Racism in the personal for me has meant identifying and recognizing microaggressions that I encounter on a daily basis at university in Ireland. Why is it that Sahar Ahmed doesn't get replies to emails inquiring about professional academic opportunities, but when I make an unexpected phone call and my voice is heard, the first thing I get is, I didn't really realize your English is so remarkable. So the very first thing that needs to be done is to acknowledge racism. If you do not acknowledge it, you cannot have a conversation about it. Ireland has a very real problem with accepting that it is a racist society. Trinity or any other university is a part of that society. You must accept that you are an institution that privileges whiteness, that racism exists within your walls, so you can learn how to undo this. Our idea of what racist also needs to expand, which cannot happen unless racism is out in the open. When black and brown students say that they experience racism, the first question they're asked is, oh my God, did someone attack you? Did you receive verbal and physical abuse? But institutionalized racism manifests itself in much more subtle and covert ways and is often dismissed and ignored by people in positions of authority. It cannot be proven in most cases. It is something that marginalized people experience through a constant othering. It just has to be taken at face value. I quote Professor Kalvan Bhopal, who is a professor of education and social justice at the University of Birmingham, who just last week actually said, we should start from the assumption that cases that are raised are racist rather than not racist. The dismissal of such covert racism undermines the position of the victim and questions whether such behavior is genuine. This perpetuates white privilege. A radical shift is needed from universities to acknowledge their long-standing role in privileging whiteness and to implement change. This can only be done by becoming comfortable with the language of race. I have used the words black, brown, and white countless times today, because this is what we are. I am very visibly brown, you are very visibly white. I teach constitutional law in the law school and as a teaching assistant, so invariably we discuss constitutional responses to discrimination and equality law. This is one of my favorite anecdotes, because during one of my classes, a white student spent a whole 2 minutes skirting around saying the word black to talk about Irish black folk, eventually landing on African American. African American to talk about black Irish people. Why? Because whiteness has always been centered, and the language and comfort required to speak about race and racialized minorities does not exist. This brings us to the second thing that needs to be done: representation and visibility in positions of power and support. How many black and brown staff members work at Trinity? For the longest time, I was the only woman of color in my department, and therefore the only teaching assistant of color. My students will probably graduate from college never having been taught by another woman of color. This is closely linked to finding sources of support. Bhopal has found through her extensive research that black and brown staff and students tend to not ask for help or to report racism, because those whom they could report to were almost always white. I am a walking, talking example of this. The college has an excellent support network of counselors, and I access their mental health services regularly. I did not want to, though, because there were no people of color working there. And I hear this all the time. Mental health professionals recognize this. My counselor acknowledged it. Why can't the university do the same? And this leads me to the last point: student bodies. Universities must address the racial makeup of their student bodies. Oxford University was recently accused of social apartheid for not admitting a single black British student in nearly 1 in 3 of its colleges. Too often, institutions that fail to recruit black and brown students talk about their commitment to diversity by highlighting the numbers of international students they have recruited. This is a very real problem in Ireland. These are hollow and superficial measures that demonstrate a lack of clarity. An increase of Indian and Chinese international postgraduate students who pay exorbitant fees does not mean the lack of representation has been solved. I pay those fees, so I know how high they are. When the playing field is level, when white home students and black home students are paying the same, suddenly the diversity disappears. I know the great work programs like the Trinity Access program are doing because I've recently been working on a program for them. But that means I've seen firsthand the numbers of kids in TAP partner schools who are not white, and the numbers at university are not reflective of that. We do not live in a post-racial society. What you look like matters. Race matters. And if we continue as we are, then whiteness and white privilege will continue to dominate in higher education institutions, with white groups doing whatever they can to protect and perpetuate their own positions of power. If the university responds to brown students speaking about institutionalized racism in higher education by panicking about she will say and having the PR office constantly ask her to tell them exactly what she will be speaking about, if any university's first point of action is to be immediately on the defensive and start talking about how it is in fact extremely progressive, extremely liberal, and is doing really well by pointing to brochures of girls in hijabs, which is institution speak for I can't be racist, I have a black friend, then it is not getting the memo. I keep being told about how much Ireland has changed. Why hasn't the university changed with it? And so I will end with an anecdote. When I first started teaching at the law school, I, like all non-Irish people, struggle with pronouncing Irish names. And so before taking my first class, I asked my friends to phonetically break down the names for me, so it would make it easier for me to pronounce them, which I wrote on the side of the attendance list. I went into class and butchered most of the names, much to no one's surprise, obviously. But there was one name which I didn't even pay attention to before class. When I reached the name on my list, I absent-mindedly just read it out, not even registering that it was an identifiably Muslim name. When it hit me, I looked up to see who it was, and looking back at me was a brown face, who mouthed, "Thank you," and looked at me with relief. It dawned on me then that I was probably the first person to have ever taught her who didn't struggle with her name, but ruined all the Irish kids' names instead. It was a profound moment for me, both as a student and as an educator. There need to be more faces like my students in the classroom at the university in Ireland, and there need to be more faces like mine teaching in the classroom at the university in Ireland. And as much as I hate ending by echoing words of a white man, Professor David Gilbourne of University of Birmingham recently said something which I cannot stress enough. If we're going to change things, it's going to be uncomfortable. So if this talk has made you uncomfortable because I have essentially called everyone white in this room inherently racist, very good. We're finally starting somewhere. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much, Shane, for this invitation. I want to begin with an apology. The world gave South Africa the responsibility to finish the critique of apartheid. 25 years later, perhaps a little more, we've got the entire critique of apartheid wrong. And so for the past few months, I've been trying to think about how one might rethink the critique of apartheid. And so my brief remarks for this evening's installment of Behind the Headlines are inspired by an Irish Times article that identified how the catastrophic climate episode in Mozambique in the past week exposed the double standards in reporting our planetary predicament. In keeping with the spirit of that article, I wondered whether it is more appropriate to ask how we might exit the scripts of race and not merely ask whether race matters. To recapitulate the concerns of the Irish Times as a question, we might ask if there is a link between our planetary crisis and the proliferation of the idea of race in recent years. If you believe, as I do, that race underwrites our planetary crisis, I believe that rethinking its attachments to technology may offer us a different perspective and a different course of action on issues such as climate change and the Anthropocene. It will require us to rethink the narrative by which we have come to understand what Hannah Arendt identified as the co-evolution of the human and technology in an article in 1958. That process of questioning is already underway, with calls to supplement studies of race and technology with explorations of race as technology. Given my sympathies with this scholarly direction, my concern rests with the extent to which the uncanny returns of race hinge upon a rapid expansion in technological objects of communication and control. Specifically, my query lies in why and how the symptom of race careered through the 19th and 20th century to return in intensified forms in fascism and apartheid. Beyond the question of identity politics, the post-colonial encounter with race largely recounts a story in which colonial narratives of blood and skin in the 19th century morphs into class and culture in the 20th, only to reappear in forms of violence in which blood, skin, class and culture coagulate. This is true of apartheid South Africa as it is true of colonial Ireland. Think only of Matthew Arnold's critical study of Celtic literature and his Culture and Anarchy, in which the British are distinguished from the Irish by the fact that the British have culture and the Irish have race. The problem with the prevailing narrative of race is that it does not proceed from the question of how we exit the scripts of race. We need a new narrative of race, one that surpasses the tendency to view race as merely a symptom or a taxonomy. Perhaps race is more of an active agent in our modernity, a supplement, a signifier that attaches to objects to direct their instrumentality. Viewed as a supplement to modernity and not simply a product of history, race reveals itself as part of the story of the co-evolution of the human and technology. The history of colonialism, therefore, only partially explains the problem of race, and then too, only as a technology of power. I wish to propose something different. The sources for the uncanny returns of race appear to rest with the convergence in 1834 of the abolition of slavery in the Caribbean and the Cape, and the scientific revolution at Cambridge University that overturned Newtonian optics in the 1800s. The abolition of British slavery resulted in the transfer of capacity entailed in slave labor to machines. I'm being very cryptic here. Unmooring the racial signification associated with the slave to detach as a free-floating signifier. Those of you who remember Stuart Hall will recognize what we're talking about when we're talking about free-floating signifiers. In the process of this detachment, the signification of race shifts from master to university. Immanuel Kant's text, The Conflict of the Faculties, and John Herschel's A Preliminary Discourse on the Study of Natural Philosophy in 1831 anticipates the shift in race from master to university. At the expense of repetition, I will emphasize that the dispersal of race that ensued with the abolition of slavery coincided with the revolution in science, initiated by 3 undergraduate students at Cambridge in the 1800s and consolidated in John Herschel's influential study on interstellar evolution while he was at the Cape in what is today South Africa. Briefly, John Herschel, son of William Herschel, settled at the Cape in 1834 to map the southern skies, where amongst other notable achievements, he coined the title to Darwin's Origins of Species. Darwin visits him in the Cape in 1836. He invented the word photography and emerged as the founding figure in resolving a problem of communication in the sciences through redefining natural philosophy. Herschel's studies in mathematics, optics, and astronomy resulted in the expansion of scientific method that placed race under the jurisdiction of scientific reason and university discourse. Knowledge would be trusted to dominate and control the signifier. Central to this redefinition of natural philosophy was the development of an inductive method that mediated between communication and control. The development of a method that addressed the problem of communication in the sciences proved reliable for shaping the debate on how race functioned as a qualification for liberal political subjectivity. The method introduced by Herschel's redefinition of natural philosophy indirectly enabled the idea that race would disappear with scientific progress and natural evolution. For no fault of Herschel, the promise of science to rein in and control the signification of race, to contain it in a taxonomic order, is probably one of the most spectacular failures of the institution of the modern university. Not long after his arrival at the Cape, a series of articles appeared in the New York Sun in 1835, citing Herschel as having discovered life on the moon. African-American scholars have called attention to the fact that the Great Moon Hoax, as it became known, reflected the panic caused by the abolition of slavery in the Caribbean and the Cape. While I agree with this analysis, I would add that it also served to appease American sensibilities with the promise of an ecological utopia in which the end of slavery would occur without disturbing the orders of racial hierarchy. In 1919, Sidire Molema, a black South African medical student in Scotland, recognized the spectacular failure of science to control the proliferation of racial signification, almost 100 years after the abolition of slavery. In a long-forgotten book that weaves its way through the Western elaboration of the promise of scientific rationality in dealing with race, he cites the South African poet Roy Campbell with a hint of exasperation. O star-eyed science, hast thou wandered there to waft us home the message of despair? The uncanny returns of race have to do with the failure of science to control its distribution and ready attachments to changes in technologies of power and technologies of memory in the making of an infinite universe. Race appears there where technology displaces signification, where meaning is surrendered to technological mechanisms of control. To exit the scripts of race then, my final 2 points, the university, which monstrously failed in containing the proliferation of a free-floating signifier, may seek to place an aesthetic education at the heart of its efforts to realign the elements that belong to the co-evolution of human and technology. Room for the humanities may be precisely what is needed to lead the way towards exiting the impasse of race, to subject it to critique by establishing a thought in motion through a training of the imagination and the senses. Thank you.
Thank you to our 4 speakers for 4 absolutely cracking talks. It really is over to you guys now. The acoustics in here are not great, so we would like you to use the microphones. And this is our practice. We'll take 2 or 3 questions and then we'll come back to the panel. For those of you who are at the back, if you're not comfortable, there's plenty of seats up here at the front. Could I ask you to identify yourself as you ask the question? So just, who'd like to kick things off? Nobody? No. There's one at the front here.
Neville Geary is my name. Neville Geary is my name.
Sorry, and you know what? That's
Hello?
That's it.
Yeah. Neville Geary is my name. I'm a graduate of this university. I'm interested in what I heard. I'm sorry for being late. And it strikes me that in talking about racism, we're talking about otherness. And that otherness is something that children learn. And we have to be very careful about this, because there are the usual funny stories about a child going to school for the first time and being asked, are there any coloured pupils in the class? And he says, I don't know, I'll have to look tomorrow. Because the child did not have colour as an element of otherness. And I've seen this...
Sorry, could you ask your question? It's just that we've got lots... I don't know if you have a question.
I do have a question. I thought it was becoming quite clear, if you don't mind.
Oh, please, so go ahead.
I was going to ask the question, is that would the panel agree that the issue is otherness, and that instinctively most children don't have colour as, or racism, if you like, as part of their innate equipment?
Thank you.
We have to find ways of dealing with that.
Thank you very much indeed. Another question, please. There's just one there at the back.
Hello. Oh, Jesus. Hello, my name is James Rooney. I was wondering if I could ask Professor Geary to indulge me by talking more about the connection between Ian Paisley and the segregated South, which he alluded to in his speech.
Oh,
Thank you.
We'll take one more and then we'll come back. There's another one at the gentleman at the back.
Yep. Hello. Hi. Thanks very much, everybody. That was 4 excellent talks. I suppose it's related to the first gent's question around, say, colour being foregrounded and generally significant as a criterion for recognising race. In recent years, there's been, I guess, scientific racism asserted, certainly as a sort of resurgence, if not in fact there. The science of race, we had race as verb rather than noun. Again, there's also the question of race as account noun being what's assumed as opposed to a biological kind of just reality to human nature. How necessarily sceptical must one be about investigations into, say, what might be called population genetics or so?
Thank you very much. I didn't catch your name.
Sorry, I'm Fergus Denman. I'm also a recent graduate of the university.
That's great. Have we another one quickly, and then we'll go back to our panel? If not, actually, we've got plenty there. So I don't know who. Dan, do you want to kick off James's very specific question, and then we'll come back to otherness, which I think everybody might like to comment on, and that links Neville and Fergus. But Dan, why don't you kick off?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. I mean, it's interesting. Paisley had connections in the U.S. well before Devlin did. And his main connections are to right-wing evangelicals who were racial segregationists. This fellow Carl McIntyre, New Jersey, but also this guy, Bob Jones at Bob Jones University, that was a segregated University of South Carolina that for a long time fought the federal government over the issue of racial segregation. Paisley got an honorary degree there in 1966. Now, Paisley himself never says like Devlin, oh, yeah, I'm like, we unionists are like the whites in the South who want to keep segregation in place. But, it's pretty telling who his friends were. And he also identified strongly with governments in Rhodesia and South Africa and the like. So, I mean, I think that there was a very similar shared mentality, that had to do with a sense of defending a country that one's ancestors had civilized. Let's put it that way. I mean, I'm sure my panelists may have more to say on the issue of whether race is something that's learned or has a genetic basis. I'm not a geneticist, but my understanding is that race has basically no genetic basis. This has been proved for a long time. People get these like ancestry kits that are going to tell them like who they really are. I mean, it's complete bogus stuff. I mean, as if it would really matter anyway. If my father's even talked about this. Well, I'm going to get a kit and see maybe there was a black relative in the past. Like, what does it matter? Like, this would have no bearing on who you are or your actual life in any case. So I'm of the view that race is not that we can just wish it away, of course, but that it's a wholly social, historical, political phenomenon and has no genetic basis whatsoever.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to pick up on that? Yeah, please, Eugenia. You need to use the mic if you don't mind. Just if you switch it on, it goes green. Yeah.
Yeah, again, with respect to both like race and its connection to color, and with respect to the genetic aspect of it, I think like perhaps a case in point here is anti-Semitism as a form of racism, where color is not apparent, but yet the prejudice is very much there. So it really doesn't have to have any kind of like basis in something that is obvious or apparent for this kind of like phenomenon to occur. It's, I think Pramesh put it very well in saying that it is a technology, a particular technology that emerged in a particular historical point around the emergence of modernity. And I want to link this to me very amusing but also very telling discussions in Stormfront, the US-based supremacist site, where they have like, they're undergoing this DNA test to show who is more white than the others. And a lot of them, as it turns out, have like black or Mexican kind of like DNA. And the typical response to this is, well, at least I'm not a Jew. Oh. So exactly. So this is a kind of discourse there that it's like really totally nonsensical. Another parallel discourse is about ancient Greece and how white were the Greeks. And in fact, like, there's a tendency to claim Greece as a specifically white kind of like culture, even though the Greeks themselves and the Romans did not see the world in these terms. So we see this, the particular kind of race, understanding of race that we have is very specific to our historical era.
Sahar, do you want to comment?
On children.
Yeah.
Yes. So.
Again, you need to just press the button and it will go green. Thank you.
I actually think that the conversation on whether children are a recognized race from early childhood is at this point in time completely irrelevant. Race is a reality, and by raising children to be colorblind, we are doing a disservice to other students who do feel othered. A child who does not see color at the age of 5 will power, in a sense, or to uplift those who are marginalized, will continue to perpetuate white privilege inherently for the rest of his life, his or her life. And I know there is a lot of talk about the fact that racism is learned, it's through your socialization, children grow up to be racist. Yes, they do, but they need to be equipped to help those who actually suffer racism. If I'm a marginalized person in a community that is entirely white, there is very little I can do. I hold absolutely no power. If I need to be able to access justice, I will invariably need support. And if I am constantly met with, well, race is irrelevant and we don't see race and no one can help me. And I think we need to get out of this trap of not seeing race, because those who carry the baggage have to experience it whether you see it or not.
Thank you. Pramesh.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. In this wonderful book by James Coetzee, there's a beautiful formulation. He says, in the shadow of death, one must tread carefully because death is a deadly thing. And, I often think about race as in those terms, as a particularly virulent and deadly thing, particularly when it coagulates. And so, I was on a panel at the, sorry, this thing is echoing.
Yeah.
I was on a panel at the Kofi Annan Center last year with two sociologists and, what was her name, Dorothea Roberts, and a geneticist, Rick Kittle, both African Americans, who spoke about gene pools from Africa and what it was leading to in scientific research in the US, on particularly cancer research. And Rick Kittle was insisting that this work is absolutely critical for science, that to disqualify race and genetics would mean that there would be massive setbacks in the study of certain kinds of cancer and their spread and so on. So I'm very nervous about treading in a space that I don't have a kind of grasp over. But I do want to say that perhaps what we ought to be doing is thinking about the coagulations of race in those moments when race presents itself as a dangerous form, as a virulent kind of articulation. And there I think we might want to script it differently. And I want to ask us to think a little bit beyond the blood and skin narrative. Because in some sense we thought apartheid was a matter of blood and skin. Until you read Hendrik Verwoerd's PhD thesis, he's the architect of apartheid in 1924. It's titled The Blunting of Emotions. He ends up in Leipzig in a debate with a Gestalt theorist in Berlin about holism, which is the very condition by which Jan Smuts had inaugurated the idea of the League of Nations through his connection. So there's a long genealogy of a race that will reappear uncannily in its most virulent forms. And I'm wondering whether we ought to attend to that. So the generalized idea of race might not be where we want to set to work in the critique of race. Perhaps it is there where it coagulates and produces some of its most dangerous kind of effects. I would suggest that we attend to those.
Thank you very much. Let's take another round of questions. Anyone else like to ask, please? So there's one at the back and one here. The gentleman here, please. And then one in the middle. Please.
Thank you.
It's okay.
My name is Adekunle Gomez, and I'd like to preface my question with something Nigeria's Wole Soyinka, the Nobel laureate, wrote. Excuse me. It was in relation to how the negative perception of Nigeria in the international media, and he was saying that this columnist said there are two people he blames for his problems, and that's his parents, because he wasn't consulted before he was born. I think the point he was trying to make is that there are three things which a person has no control: your gender, the country you are born, and the race. And yet they are the three things we always try to blame people for. Now, when I look at the question, does race matter? Now I ask myself, well, should it matter? In the sense that you know a choice as to what you are born. And in the relation to gender, only last week, the NASA had to postpone its flight because the suits for women were not right. So again, it is unconscious prejudice. Now, so my question is that should we not, because when we talk about race, it's kind of an adjective, racial prejudice. Should we not be talking about prejudice? Okay. And if you ask me, does prejudice matter? I would say definitely it does matter. and we need to address it. So I don't know what you think.
Thank you. So that's very helpful. There was a question at the back. Just if you hold it quite close.
My name is Sarah, and I'm a student here. And I have a question about the term race itself, because I'm French, and in France we don't talk about race. It has a negative connotation. And I just would like to understand why in the English language it doesn't have a negative connotation. Do you know what that is?
That's a very good question as well. I think there was a lady here in the middle.
Yetta is my name, and I just wanted to ask a question.
Sorry, what was your name?
Yetta is my name. I've done research on slavery for the past 9 years, and my question is basically put to the two women mainly, very much about, you mentioned data, technology, Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever. I'm in a big discussion with LinkedIn at present about a book I recommended to someone whom neither want me to recommend. It's a historical book about eugenics, and that has to do with race. The law in this, and how can we change this mindset within social media?
Thank you very much. Do you want to start with that one, Eugenia?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult, and I don't know basically how to address it, because this is a very central issue in terms of, let's say, our culture that centers around idealized notions of freedom of speech. So that's why I mentioned the kind of like liberal ideology of this kind of like the Silicon Valley type of social media platforms. So they will always privilege freedom of speech over over, let's say, the right of others not to be targeted. So unless there is a kind of like a more holistic kind of approach to the whole thing, I don't think that you can target hate speech on its own without addressing the question of misogyny and patriarchy and racism and race in the broader social context. I don't think you can resolve it by policing the digital public sphere at all. And what we have seen is basically that the racist will adapt to that. So, for example, in our work, we found that there were already metonymies used. So, for example, religion of peace to refer, but in negative terms, to Islam, meaning the exact opposite. So you cannot take this down. It's not hate speech, but at the same time, it is toxic. So it's a never-ending. It's the many-headed hydra, if you want. So you cannot address it on its own. You have to address it in its entirety.
Do you want to come in there, Sahar, or Pramesh, actually, either of you? Yeah.
So one of the biggest complications with technology, and particularly with social media platforms, is how to regulate it, right? Eugenia is doing a very important part of it, but lawyers always stumble on this. And as someone who, I'm not an expert in technology law by any means at all, but from friends who are doing it and from other experts that I encounter on a daily basis, this is a very serious problem that what law do they apply, where do they apply it? It is one of the most border proliferating mediums that exists in the world, if not the most, and every country has a very different approach to what it deems hate speech, what it does not. And so lawyers stumble on how to address this on social media platforms, and I don't know whether any of them have a definitive answer yet, to be very honest. And I think it leads to the larger problem of when you have algorithms like Eugenia was talking about, it's impossible to be able to identify every individual thing. So if this book is in question, the nuance of what that book talks about is going to be lost, obviously, because you're promoting a title, and that's it. But there's larger conversations to be had on if we're doing holistic policing of sorts online, which actually address more than just what the nuance of the material being promoted is, it becomes more complicated. And unfortunately, for your post on the book, I really don't think any of us will have a very definitive answer on whether you'll be able to post it effectively or not.
We don't have to. Do you want to say anything?
So I think all the panelists, my colleagues on the panel, are talking about the excess of race and how one kind of thinks about it historically, through the kind of question of technology and the law. And I think that, this has been a question that has been with us for many years on the African continent. Soyinka and others were part of a generation that led us into thinking about humanism as a kind of world picture. And when Europe gave up on the world picture, those anti-colonial movements still thought of themselves in relation to the world. I mean, it's very clear that the anti-colonial struggles in much of the third world were premised on a world picture. We don't have major icons from the West who have such a world picture. That's why you have, the Gandhis, Nehrus and Mandelas and Soyinkas and others who are always trying to think through humanism with all its problems and limitations as a kind of condition for a world picture. So I think that, there's something to be learned. The South has something to teach here. And that might be that, Europe might want to think about a world picture in the age of Brexit, I suppose.
I was going to say,
don't say that.
Don't even go there, Dan.
Yeah, I just wanted to address the sort of question of, well, what is the term race and should we use this term race? I mean, I think it's a complicated term, and academic discourse can mean many things, and there's reasons for it, but, I think we do need to be careful when race is used as a neutral synonym for what we mean as racism. I mean, it's been interesting to watch since Donald Trump has become president, the mainstream media tying itself at knots, trying to describe his racist comments as something else. Like, you'll see it described as racially tinged or racial or something. No, the word is racist. So, I mean, I think race should never be used as a synonym for racism. We shouldn't be afraid to call a thing what it is.
Yeah. Do you want to? Please.
Just a comment on the question about France and the French understanding of race, or lack of understanding of race, in my view. I think that that France followed a different historical trajectory with respect to its nation building that was based on supposedly universal ideas of, like, equality, liberty and fraternity. But in actual fact, I always will remember days that in the riots of Paris in around 2005, when Sarkozy mentioned that these people should be sent back, even though they were French for like generations, just because they, or maybe their background was North African. So race in France does exist, but it exists in a state of denial. The same with the girls and the struggles for the hijab or the struggles for the long skirts. So it's exactly what Sahar was talking about, this denial of race.
In fact, about France, this is something I actually have research on. And so one of the things that I have to look at a lot is the supposed burqa ban. The one area where race constantly comes up when it comes to my research is those who are targeted by France's laws when it comes to secularism. And because when I look at Europe particularly. And one of the conversations that keeps getting lost, at least on academic forums and within scholarship, is the very racialized nature of this burqa ban, or any bans that overtly target religious symbols, because the women that they're targeting predominantly tend to be women of color. And whilst it is on a basis of a religious symbol, and that is made very, very clear in legislation, in parliamentary debates, in commentary, 100%, but there are very overt racialized undertones of that, which are felt on a daily basis. And that is a conversation that is almost entirely lost. And I think that's a very interesting point on the fact that race doesn't come up in the French language as a negative connotation, which probably will inform my research quite heavily now.
In French we talk about the human race.
So I think that's very interesting, but certainly, perhaps it is because of this lack of language around it that perpetuates this problem. France has a problem, but there is just very little commentary on it. It's always talked about the Muslim women, completely ignores that those Muslim women are predominantly black or brown. So.
Let's take some questions from others who haven't had a chance yet. Anyone else want to put some questions to our panel? What, please.
My name is Angus O'Loughlin. I'm a graduate of Trinity. I'm interested in Sahar's talk. There was an emphasis on practicality and that non-white people can't do this on their own. From an institutional standpoint, I'd love to hear the panel's opinions on where you start reforming those institutional biases and those.
That's a great question. Can we take another one? Because is there any others at all? Well, I have one then, if I may, and I'd like Premish to say a little bit more about the handspring puppets, because unless there are any other questions, we'll finish up with this. So we'll talk about the institutional, the very practical steps, and obviously Sahar will come to you, but I think everybody might like to reflect on that. And then Premish, if you could also talk, because I think the work that you're doing with handspring is so we'll maybe come to you at the end, but Sahar, would you mind kicking off?
Yes, so there's multiple facets to that question. The first facet is what a lot of racial justice activists and scholars, particularly in the US, answer that question of, well, what should we do practically about it is, well, we've told you there's a problem, figure it out. Which in terms of the fact that why are those questions of what are the practical steps to be taken always posed by white people to non-white people, perpetuating further the labor Eugenia was talking about in terms of even reporting the racism. So I'm not going to actually give that answer. I was just telling you that that is one of the answers that you might have expected from someone else. However, I think one of the big things that a university or any institution can really do to address it is I am inclined to, and I can be challenged on this, I have been challenged on this multiple times. The UK has the Race Equality Charter, which it has put in place recently, and whilst there's loads that's wrong with it, it could present a really good platform for borrowing what they do when it comes to the mark system. Ireland borrowed the Athena Swan system, took it over from the UK when it came to gender equality at institutions. Certainly, it can also do so when it comes to the Racial Equality Charter. And what that would require is that the university will have to do a very thorough self-assessment on what it does to level the playing field, so to say, when it comes to racial equality within institutions. But again, the question then is this considered a priority? Clearly not. We don't have any definitive, apart from the Equality Acts that we do have in Ireland, we don't really have anything that talks about institutionalized racism at all. So practically, it might be, I know we criticize UK these days a lot, but they seem to be trying to do this slightly well. So it might be worth borrowing as on practical terms in terms of the university, trying to borrow that perhaps.
Thank you. I think Athena Swan has made, but it's not just the universities. I think the government has got behind the equality. It's not just about gender. It's about equality, and so we need it to be both university driven, but also the state. So yeah, I don't know. Do you want to add something, please?
Okay, just a brief comment on how this is playing out in, let's say, the technology companies in Silicon Valley, because we know that there is a lack of black people and women participating in the making of new technologies, and this is bound to be extremely problematic in some of the ways I've already described. But for example, you might remember the infamous James Damore Google memo where he said, well, what you want, women are incapable of programming. So you get a lot of this kind of like prejudice couched in terms of meritocracy. So they're telling you, okay, it's only the best, only the ones that are good for this are entitled to be in universities, in the tech sector, in this and that, in the government. But in fact, they are creating barriers for anyone else to enter. So it's this kind of like dismantling of this kind of system that discriminates, basically, that's how somehow what we need to address.
Dan, as somebody who's been teaching this for years, do you have any insights what we as an institution should be doing?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this just now. I mean, given what Sahar has been saying, I mean, in the United States, obviously, this has been dealt with for a long time, and there's ongoing things where people are examining the statues of, various founders who maybe were slaveholders or slave traders or the like. It is, I think, a different history over here, and I do think there is more of a tendency maybe to ignore institutional racism here because the Irish have a past history of being racialized themselves. But, I mean, I think this is something that, the process of self-reflection would be the first way forward. That would have to take in the current situation, and I suppose the history of Trinity in particular. Because I don't think it's Ireland that's doesn't have, it has a very peculiar history of race. That's not to say that it's not racist, but has a peculiar history that would need to be interrogated there.
Ramesh.
Yes, thank you very much. Is this on? Yeah, there we are. So I would invite Trinity College to visit us at the University of the Western Cape to think about what it might mean to undo the racial legacies of a university. We are formed as a historically black university by apartheid. So every morning you go to work to disavow the foundations of your university rather than to preserve it and protect it. That said, it was the first university to break the Apartheid Act in 1987, and where many of the exiles, including Kada, returned to. Kada was the first professor of human rights law at UWC, and tried to reimagine what a post-apartheid South Africa would look like. And one of the key features that they missed, and this is my critique of them, of that generation, is that they thought that they could do this through a systematic kind of approach through the law. But there was no attention to aesthetic education, to the expressive disciplines. And the black universities were universities that were established to control populations, to administer populations. They were not set up for any forms of expression. There are no art schools at those universities, except for the University of Fort Hare. And what we've tried to do is, through this project with Handspring Puppet Companies, to think through the prosthesis of the puppet. And Handspring has done very important work. Ubu and the Truth Commission is one of them. But they've also done Wojciech. They've taken key European projects, like Faustus in Africa, and tried to think about what it would mean to place the problem of race at the heart of the work of the theatre. And to say that we might want to think through the inheritance of race and to try and undo it in ways that will allow us, that will give us another lease on life rather than a narrative of utter despair.
And I think the invitation for Trinity to go to Cape Town is a very welcome one, and I'm sure many of us actually would, all seriousness, it's such an important thing to do. I was the Vice President for Global Relations here back in 2011 to 14, and the one MOU that we signed in Cape Town was with the University of Western Cape. And it was to honour our relationship with Cadar Asmal, and the South African government set up a number of Cadar Asmal fellowships between Ireland and the University of Western Cape Town. So it's really, these relationships are hugely important. We have an awful lot to learn as well. I'd like to just wrap things up by inviting our panel to give one practical thing that we can all take away this evening that actually reinforces why race does matter, and what we all, says she, doing something to the computer here, sorry. But what should we all think about doing to actually address this in a very proactive way? So if we could literally just go across the panel, if you could each just suggest one very practical thing that would actually make a difference in your opinion. So Dan, can we start with you?
Thanks, Jane.
Well, we can finish with you if you want.
What's the practical thing? Well, I mean, I guess I'm going to hopefully get more practical comments here, but I mean, thinking about this is a good way to go about it. But I think that people need to remember that race is enmeshed in other relationships, and I think there's a danger that if you just talk about race, that some of these other things might fall out. Race does a particular kind of work, and if you just, it's like a Lego house or something. Like if you just remove a block from the middle, the thing's going to collapse. So I think there's a broader discussion that needs to be had about all sorts of inequalities that exist in our modern societies. And I think one of the things we're seeing, it's not the only reason, but one of the things we're seeing today, obviously across Europe and the United States, is a rise in racial thinking and in racism that's partly due to inequalities that are brought about by economic circumstances. And so I think that we can't think of race as just something we can do away with simply by teaching people not to be prejudiced. So it has to be part of it too.
And that takes us back to that earlier question about prejudice.
I will focus on my own topic, which is hate speech in digital media. One of our important findings was that people who are attacked in social media really appreciate others standing up for them. So most of us would think of, if we are witnesses, let's say, to an attack, we either switch off or we say, okay, it's nothing to do with me because they don't attack me. But you have to think of it as attacking you as well, because this kind of toxicity spreads. If you don't stop it, it will spread. So it's not a question of not concerning you. It does concern you even if it doesn't directly attack you. So I would urge all of us not to be bystanders looking at the thing as spectators, but to be active participants in stopping this. Thank you.
I'm going to echo Eugenia here. Don't be an ally, be a race traitor. Cede power as effectively and actively as you can. And exactly like was just said, acknowledge that by not taking action when you see it around you, and the action doesn't have to be violent overtly, action doesn't have to be physical or verbal, action can be very, very subtle. And if it is affecting someone, and you can, even if you can't see it, you should be able to tell that it is affecting someone, do something about it. If you don't, you are part of the problem of racism. You are racist then. And I think the one thing I would acknowledge, really encourage everyone to take away from here is be comfortable with accepting that you might be racist, so that you can actually stop being one.
Thank you. Pramesh.
I would say that what we need to do is reinvent the idea of the university as a site for the training of the imagination and the senses, and that what we need are more Wally Shoyinkas and fewer kind of tyrants.
That's a great final statement. So I've just a couple of announcements before we thank our panel. On Monday, the 1st, we have the next talk in our Out of the Ashes lecture series, and it's by Lorna Hughes and Claire Bray, who are talking about safeguarding memories, past and present, stories from the British Library. So we'd love to see you at that. Then on the 15th of April, we've got the next in our What Does It Mean to Be Human series, and we've got Lisa Godson, who is a cultural historian at the National College of Art and Design. And again, you're so welcome at that. For all of these, you do need to sign up through our website. And then on the 1st of May, we're hosting a very special dramatic reading by the French writer and philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy as part of his 22 European city tour looking for Europe. Obviously, just on the eve of the European elections, and it's very much part of our Crisis in Democracy initiative, and that will take place in the Public Theatre. Again, you need to get tickets online for that. We also have, Premish is one of our visiting research fellows. We have lunchtime fellow in focus talks, and just so you're aware of these, details are on our website. You're always very welcome at the lunchtime talks as well as these evening events. So all I really want to do now is thank the staff in the Trinity Longroom Hub for doing the amazing job they do, to thank you all for coming on the most beautiful spring evening. I'm telling you, you really wanted to be here this evening, and we really appreciated that, for the great questions. But above all, I'd like to invite you to join me in thanking our 4 speakers for, I think, 4 really, really wonderful presentations. So if we could just thank our speakers.